Hello and welcome back to the course on Python programming. Today we're finally looking at functions in Python. I know we've already been working with functions so much and it feels like we already know them so well that it even feels that we don't really need this tutorial. But nevertheless, let's solidify all of the knowledge that we've gathered around functions, talk about how they work, what they're for, and have a look at a couple of examples. Alright, so how do functions work? And first question, Kirill, why do you have a blender and fruit and berries on this image? Well, because this in my head is one of the best representations of how functions work and what their purpose is. I think of a function as a blender. You input fruit and berries into a blender and then you click a button and it does its magic, and in the end you have a wonderful delicious smoothie. And that's what functions do. So they take some inputs, they perform some calculations or some other derivations, and then they give you an output which you further use in your program for whatever purposes you like. So they're a aggregator or a convenient modifier of the information that you pass on to them. So let's have a quick look at some examples that functions that we've been working with, and a couple of new functions as well. All right, so where is our IPython notebooks? There it is. And let's get started. So we've already talked about a few functions. I'm just going to mention a couple of them that we've discussed before. So first thing, we're going to create a list, right? So how do we create a list? We can either use the square brackets, or we know of a function. We know of a function which is range. So there it is, range, and it takes some parameters. Like a blender takes berries and fruit as inputs, so does the range function take parameters. So let's say we want to start our range at 20 and we want to go all the way up to 30, including 30, so we're going to put 31. So if I run that, as we discussed in Python 3, we don't actually get a list, we get a generator or iterator, and therefore if we want to turn to a list, we have to use another function. So this function, list, will convert something into a list, right? That's its purpose. And that's the type of smoothies that it makes. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to take this range and we're going to pass it to that list. So if I run this now I get a list. Now I can use this and put it into a storage facility, like the smoothie that you get from a blender. You put it into a glass, for example. So here we're going to say my list 1, and I'm going to pass it this output. So if I run this, I get my list 1. If I run my list 1, now it contains that result. So we started with these inputs, 20 and 31. We got a range. That range was an input for the next function, which was a list. And the list function returned an actual list, which we now have and we can use for other purposes. And that's exactly what we're going to do. So that's two functions we talked about already. Here's another one. We know this function, print. So if we print my list 1, it will output it onto the screen. There we go. That's the proper way of printing things onto our screen. Another function that we've already kind of touched on is the len function. So let's get the length of this list, my list 1. There we go. So that tells us that there are 11 elements. So as you can see, we're passing this function len quite a lot of information. We're passing it all these values and plus the indexation. So there's a lot of information in this list, and the output is just one number. And that's the purpose of that function. It counts the number of elements and gives you that result. Let's look at another function. Let's say type. So same thing, my list 1, we're passing the exact same input. So as you can see in all these three cases, we're passing the same inputs, my list 1 to function print, but this result is different to this result and is going to be different to this result. So here is just printing the list. This one is telling us how many values, and this one is telling what type of object we're dealing with. All right, great. And let's have a look at two more. So these are two new ones, very straightforward functions. So max, if we take max of my list 1, we'll get the maximum value. And if we take min of my list 1, we get the minimum value. And also you can use max and min for other purposes. You can pass values to them. You can just pass them values not in a list. So you can say 11, 435, 7, something like that. It will still work like that. So this function can be passed a list or just a series of values, and so on. So that is how functions work. And a good point to make here is that the core of Python actually doesn't have that many useful functions. It's surprisingly very lean on content. And that is the design on purpose. Python was created in that way to make it as efficient as possible. And then in order to expand the functions that are available to you, you need to include packages. You need to include add-ons to your Python in order to make it more robust and to include more visualization packages or mathematical packages or packages for working with data frames and so on. And that's what we're going to talk about in the next tutorial when we're talking about packages. So hopefully functions are pretty straightforward and by now you're very comfortable with them already. Let's jump straight into the next tutorial and I'll see you there. Until next time, happy coding.